back to the World Lens podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, and today I am joined by WTCI board member and president of McIndoe Risk Advisory, Bruce McIndoe. Hey, Bruce, how's it going?
Every day is a different day.
That is factual.
Yeah, doing all right.
So, we're going to talk about Venezuela today and kind of the impacts of it. So,
Mhm.
in case you are living under a rock, early on the morning of January 3rd, the United States executed a high stakes military raid in Caracas to capture President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. So I want to start by let's talking about like what actually happened during the operation. From what we know, there were some U.S. casualties. There were 7 service members injured. A helicopter was damaged. Venezuelan sources are saying that around 40 to 100 deaths, including civilians. How do we square that with what initially seemed like a surgical strike? And what does that tell us about the real challenges of an operation like this?
Okay. The facts do change, it seems, not daily, but frequently.
Yeah.
So, what looked surgical, right, was definitely
Mm-hmm.
surgical in intent, right? They had a very narrow objective: capture Maduro, clearly, and his wife, and extract him out safely, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, from that perspective, that's good, but it's not necessarily surgical in the effects of that
Yeah.
success, right? And that's I guess what when I look at things like this, I'm going to say there's like three things that can be true at the same time when you say a surgical strike, right? So the U.S. clearly hit its objectives, right? They captured
Mm-hmm.
him, brought him out safely, limited U.S. casualties, and all of that good stuff, right?
Right.
And there was heavily armed protection in this compound. So yes, surgical strike, pat on the back, success, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, uh, the fight at the objective was in all readings, was close range, intense. You've got a dense urban environment, heavily armed protection. That's tough, right? And so the
Mm-hmm.
death toll, and this is what's really been disputed. Like you said, the Venezuelans have claimed more than 100, and U.S.
Mm-hmm.
officials basically said they thought around 75, and then Cuba reported that 36 of their civilians got killed. So civilians and armed security personnel, died in this event, right?
Right.
So you have all of that. That's why when you look at the news, it's like, oh, this is a surgical strike. We went in, we got Maduro and his wife, and we took him out, right? Well, there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
collateral damage, right? So
Right.
there's no question that the operation was amazingly executed by the military, and
Mm-hmm.
capture missions are inherently high risk, and then
Very.
strike only, shooting missiles in is easy stuff. But they require persistence, control, and doing the extraction under fire. So all of that was going on that day.
Yeah, it does seem like a lot.
Yeah.
It said that the operation was framed as like law enforcement with some military support, basically going after him because he was under federal indictment. But
Mm-hmm.
we've been seeing those boat strikes in the Caribbean for months now, which is raising eyebrows internationally.
Sure. Yeah.
So what do we think this administration? Why do we think this administration has leaned more towards an aggressive methods rather than traditional approach?
I guess the traditional approach would be the Coast Guard.
Yeah.
So yeah, so I guess at the headline is the military gave them deterrence. That's a
Mhm.
serious threat out there, and speed, right? So they could basically execute this, do military strikes, and it's the shock value, right? If you want
Yeah.
to put deterrence out there, and if I'm a fast boat with a bunch of drugs in it and all, and every time people go out there they get blown up, kind of deters that activity, right?
Very true.
So I think that was why they used the military and didn't want to get the Coast Guard and trying to interdict and board and
Mm-hmm.
apprehend all that kind of stuff. So the this aggressive approach provided a new legal political framing for the administration to treat these traffickers as a national security terrorist problem, and that gave them backup authorities as far as what they're trying to do. Now that'll be debated for who knows how long, but that
Right.
was, I think, their motivation. So I think it's much less why not the Coast Guard. They wanted military high grade visibility to shape behavior very quickly, and they did that. So
Kind of get them shaking in their boots.
I would be
I mean, who wouldn't?
right.
So Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves, plus a significant deposit of rare earth minerals, which is pretty crucial for everything from electric vehicles to defense tech. But quick check. Having resources and actually converting them into economic recovery are two very different things. What are the actual bottlenecks here? Are we talking months, years, decades before we see any type of stabilization?
Yeah, this has been swirling around. I think anybody that's even close to this business, and I work with
Mm-hmm.
a company that specialized in working with extractives industry, right? So
Mm-hmm.
minerals and oil. It is absolutely not realistic that they're going to increase Venezuelan, oil extraction and output in any significant way for years.
Mm-hmm.
I think the estimate right now is like probably would be on the order of $10 billion a year and could
Mm-hmm.
take a decade. So you're talking, $100 billion of investment,
Okay.
right? So
Yeah.
so that's what's been thrown around. Venezuela has these resources. One is, proven like reserve of oil, right? So this,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I don't know about proven, but that's like estimate, of what they think they have. But actually extracting that oil is
Mm-hmm.
not like you just, oh, well, it's just a big pot in there and you put
Let's go
a
grab it.
bowl, a straw in there and you suck it out, right? So there's those kinds of problems. Same thing with the minerals, right? And then
Right.
what do you do with it once you pull it out of the ground? Well, right now, China has 90% of the rare earth metal processing capability.
Mm.
So now I've got all this pile of rubble and rocks, and I want to extract these minerals. Who's going to do it, right?
Right.
So that's a problem. And then of course the oil that comes out in Venezuela is called heavy oil, and very few refineries. It's more costly to produce from that and all that. So the U.S. can take it, and others that have that capability. But it's again, so it's a I guess what does a timeline look like?
Yeah.
The base case that I saw from oil industry reporting is, look, we can have steady but gradual recovery. They're a little under 1 million now. They peaked around 2.5, 3 million when they were fully up and operating. So kind of clawing that back, I think
Mm-hmm.
is something that's can happen. But they have collapsed refineries and broken equipment, and the talent has fled, right? So you can't just like throw a switch. But the biggest issue, and this came up, is that the in order to do this, you have to have sustained investment commitment, political stability in the country, security guarantees by the U.S., regulatory reform to as far as how this is dealt with, and this is exactly what the CEOs from ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips said in that meeting with Trump and caused, I'll say, friction, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's true that they're not going to rush in there with these kind of investments if all of those things aren't true. So I'd say in the short term, expect market volatility, no production surge. In the medium term, we can see some incremental improvements, and
Mm-hmm.
I think there was a quote in a article that I was reading from one of the in the energy and oil industry, and the person said, "Look, this system was built for corruption, not production."
Hmm.
And it's like, okay, that kind of says it all.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that's again back to the top line is the bottom line. It's not realistic that
No.
we're going to see any meaningful production anytime
Yeah.
soon.
So it kind of begs the question, why?
Why?
Why do it if there's like no foreseeable future in the next 10 years?
No, but the why is like you go into any environment and you do the geology, you look and see what's there, then you bring in infrastructure and then you dig it up and then so that's a long process. That's how we
Mm-hmm.
do all these things. I mean, Greenland would be another example of that, right? Even though it has whole other challenges. But the point is that those reserves are there, those minerals are there. That's been
Mm-hmm.
deemed as a national security and of national importance that we have access to that. And if it takes 5 years or 10 years to get at it, that's playing the long game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, something that surprised a few people when the US chose to work with Rodriguez, Maduro's vice president, and somebody who's been sanctioned for human rights abuses, instead of Machado, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize and has spoken favorably about Trump. What's the
Hmm.
strategy there? Like, what does this reveal about the priorities during this transition?
Yeah, I think it's similar to using the military and not the Coast Guard.
Yeah.
So my short answer would be, the U.S. clearly is prioritizing functional control over
Mm-hmm.
democratic legitimacy, right?
Mm.
So Rodriguez actually can deliver what Washington wants now, right? And Machado Dow can't deliver it, right? This would be like a whole new insertion, would create much upheaval and all that stuff. So right now they want some level of stability to work through these, issues and kind of keep the country viable and not just completely go into chaos, right? So that's really why they're doing it. And so, the three reasons that I wrote down in my notes is she controls the levers of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
And between her and her husband and others, she can deliver on what the administration needs immediately by taking action so they're not has to go through a whole process to try to
Right.
bring in a new leadership, right? And through the reports that I read and what she's done is, she's already negotiated with the US, right?
Hmm.
Prior to. So I would say those are the kind of the three things. So it wasn't about who deserves to lead Venezuela. I think it was a U.S. intelligence estimate that stability comes from those who can prevent violence and can you know manage the situation as it exists today and not kind of have electoral legitimacy some 6 months or a year down the
Right.
road. So yeah.
More instant. Gotcha.
Mhm.
But this is like a real departure from the, no endless war messaging that we heard during his campaign. So, what does success actually look like here? How do we measure it? How do we avoid turning this into an open ended committee commitment? Like, what's
Commitment,
the
yeah.
exit strategy?
Hmm. So you're absolutely right. You can say it seems to contradict Trump's
Mm-hmm.
anti-intervention stance. I would say it absolutely does contradict, and that's creating fractures in his support base, right? That are
Right.
going, oh, what are you doing? You said it was,
Mm-hmm.
we were going to focus on America. We weren't going to spend billions of dollars out wandering around, dealing with other people's problems. So I think that they're trying to clearly thread the needle here. Kind of maximum leverage, minimum footprint, and there's a lot to kind of unpack in how that happened. But I think the bigger question that's roaming around is, what does success actually mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's pretty uh, clear from kind of what the communications have come out from the administration that they've defined success, you know, pretty narrowly, and I will say transactionally. So, oil access, right? So
Mm-hmm.
long-term U.S. control over those Venezuelan reserves, right? And of course, the oil companies getting favorable extraction deals in that process. So that was one transaction. Migration control, right? So, and especially in Venezuela, accepting, deportees from the U.S. So that's number
Mm-hmm.
two. And then the other one that we can see playing out, and every day, something new, but this, geopolitical isolation, right? Cutting off Cuba and Iran, and and those kinds of levers that he's trying to pull to impact follow on,
Mm-hmm.
concessions from other countries. So that's how they've defined success,
Success.
and
Mm-hmm.
and so, how do we avoid an open-ended commitment, I guess, is, so we're in there. I again, another headline in some of the conversations and stuff. This was on a webinar I was listening to a couple of days ago. On this issue,
Mm-hmm.
what's going to happen? Are we going to get sucked into a long-term commitment?
Right.
The headline was, if you break it, you own it. Okay, so it kind of says it all right there, right? We
Yeah.
broke it, and we are very much going to be sucked into owning it,
Mm-hmm.
and having to deal with that. So again, the strategies relying on, coercion from the U.S. without occupation, no boots on the ground. That's kind of their
Mm-hmm.
strategy. So, working through Rodriguez, um, using the threat of renewed military action to kind of keep her in place.
Mm-hmm.
Let the Venezuelans do the actual governing as long as they follow our orders, right? And then let's get the extraction going, and see if this thing plays out. And that's okay. That's the game plan that they're working through. So I was asked, on another meeting, that briefing I did, at the
Mm-hmm.
end of last week, kind of, let's walk through the scenarios and what's kind of best, most likely, and worst case. So I'll just
Mm-hmm.
say, so the best case is, yes, she retains control and delivers on the oil migration and gradually, reduces Cuban aid, and no troops on the ground, and everybody's happy and all that good.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the best case. Let's put
Worst
most
case.
likely, and that would be like, well, this is a moderismo, kind of like playing off of the history there, without Madro. So kind of the system persists, cosmetic changes, we secure the oil deals. We have, periodic shows of force to maintain compliance, but no full occupation. But it's not a clean exit either, because we're constantly spending money with military and kind of trying to
Mm-hmm.
keep them to do the right thing, right? And then unfortunately, the worst case, which is what everyone that I talk to is worried about,
Mm-hmm.
is regime fragmentation, right? So it actually becomes chaotic, that she
Yeah.
can't maintain control against rivals like, um, what's his name, Diosdado, and Cabello, right? And the
Mm-hmm.
who's the interior minister that has the ties with the military. So then you get competing power centers, and it becomes ungovernable, right? So at that point, the Trump administration faces a really ugly choice. Do they have deeper intervention, meaning now they got to put
Yeah. Put
people
boots on the
in on the
ground.
ground, or do
Mm-hmm.
they accept the chaos and then walk away? That, okay, I broke the stuff. I'm not actually going to own it. I'm just going to walk away. So that's the real risk where we
Yeah.
are. And yeah, I just think, the next every day something new is happening, but I would say in the next 30 to 60 days, we will more firmly know what path we're on with Venezuela, as we
Yeah.
talk about all this. You know. It's not like, I mean, I have no crystal ball, we can finish this recording and then tomorrow something,
Something different. Yeah.
totally different could happen. But I think it's going to take, and there's other dynamics. There's, capital, there's oil flows, there's the same thing with Cuba, the kind of this whole thing in the next 30 to 60 days will either go on a decent path or it's going to go
Or
upside down. So,
yeah. So that kind of
long
leads
one.
me into Maduro wasn't exactly popular internationally, but the way that he was removed is creating some kind of, discord, even with allies. Do you think this backlash will have a lasting impact, or, will this affect US credibility or relationships long term, or will it blow over once everything stabilizes?
Okay, well, this one I'll answer more succinctly. So the question isn't whether this action has damaged U.S. legitimacy. It clearly has
Mm-hmm.
internationally, not just within our backyard. So the question is whether countries will actually change their behavior
Mm,
because of it, or just accept it as the new normal under Trump, right? So that's where we are. In the near term, I see kind of minimal consequences from this action. Countries are too afraid or too dependent
mm-hmm.
to meaningfully push back on what Trump's doing. So that's kind of where we are in the near term. But in the long term, I do think it's personally, potentially very significant. I think this operation is going to accelerate Latin America's efforts to reduce dependence on Washington, on the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
not through confrontation, but through just quiet diversification of their economic and security partnerships. And they're already, many of these countries have strong relationships with China, right?
Yeah.
And they can say, look, we're not going to put up with this. We're going to start doing deals and ramp up support with China, and that's going to raise the stakes for the U.S. and the Western Hemisphere. My thought. So kind of over the long term,
Mm-hmm.
I'm worried. You
So I guess a bigger concern is, does this set a precedent? Other countries and powers may use this to justify their own actions when it comes to their own adversaries like China or Russia. Should we
hmm
be worried how this operation gets weaponized rhetorically?
um, when you say a bigger concern, I think this is at the top. What is the bigger concern, right? Yes, in the world order post World War II, the U.S. was the policeman, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, those would all be bigger concerns, right? If you think about us as a player within our Western hemisphere, kind of the imperialist U.S., is that a big concern that China takes Taiwan or whatever? Yes, it is.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously the ripple effect because of the ties economically. So everything is complicated, right? And I can tell
Yeah.
you that China and Russia have never been constrained by international norms when it comes to their core interests, right?
That's true.
And so it's already there, right? Regardless of what he did or didn't do, early in the start of this year. So, Russia invaded Ukraine, China threatens Taiwan like every
Taiwan.
day.
Yeah.
And basically any country that touches the South China Sea, right? That they're at odds with. So they don't need us or international permission. So that's off the table. So, but it has changed. What I'll call the rhetorical cover, because the U.S. could prior to this credibly claim kind of that moral high ground, right? That said,
Mm-hmm.
you don't do this, right? You don't just go in and take over a country or remove the head of state or whatever it might be. So
Never
it's
been that.
very hard to condemn now China, Russia, and anyone else. So yes, that's definitely should is the problem. So so how concerned should we be about that? I'd say moderately to very concerned. Not
Mm-hmm.
because this is going to fundamentally change the behavior of countries like Russia and China, but because it accelerates what always this shift toward this purely transactional might makes right system, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what we're in the middle, not in the middle, in this very like accelerated start of this transition from this US led world order to now this world order of power transaction, and you end up with very few diplomatic off ramps when you get into
Yeah.
that world order, and that's where we're headed.
Do you see this as a broader shift in U.S. foreign policy, basically a willingness to take direct action when it comes to economic or security interests? Or do you think this was just driven by proximity or regional concerns?
Yeah, I think that's what I was just saying, that this is a broader shift in U.S. foreign
Mm-hmm.
policy and our national security strategy and all of that. Out there I see them using the Dawn Row Doctrine, right? And which is a play off of the Monroe Doctrine that was there, and so and that I think embodies to a large degree kind of what we're seeing here in the early 1800s. The Monroe Doctrine was a U.S. foreign policy principle that declared, hey, that European powers should not interfere with affairs of the U.S. in the Western Hemisphere, and in
Mm-hmm.
exchange, we would stay out of
Right.
their backyard. Okay, so the Don Rowe Doctrine now is essentially the Trump spin on that says, look,
Yeah.
we're the powerful big dog in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to start to assert ourselves and stay out of our business, and we'll stay out of your business. So that's what is we look
Mm-hmm.
at and say, now is that of concern? Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
concern for everybody, because that's a significant shift in how the world operates. And
Mm-hmm.
we already see fragmentation. We see fragmentation in the G20. We see fragmentation in the macro level, and it creates uncertainty, and nobody likes that. So,
Yeah. So shifting gears to Greenland.
uh-huh.
Stephen Miller recently said nobody's going to fight the United States militarily over the future of Greenland. And, it's no secret
Okay,
Trump's
we'll talk about that, but go ahead. Sorry.
pretty explicit about wanting it. So after
Mhm.
Venezuela, does this make a move on Greenland more plausible, or are we still like negotiating tactics?
Uh, so statements like that, I believe, are negotiating tactics, but
Mm-hmm.
with some hugely important caveats, right?
Okay.
Greenland is fundamentally different than,
Mm-hmm.
you know, I don't know, Colombia, Cuba, Venezuela, right, Guyana. And it's so fundamentally different that a military action to take Greenland would be catastrophic.
Mm-hmm.
So that's and this comes, I guess, the most first and most importantly, Denmark is a NATO country. Denmark has responsibility for Greenland. So essentially, we would be attacking a NATO
And they,
ally, right?
mm-hmm.
So that would basically turn the U.S. against the members of the NATO alliance, right? And it's like, well, then what? And
Mm-hmm.
it was the Denmark's prime minister recently, just a few days ago, basically said, if that happens, then quote, everything stops.
Mm-hmm.
Well, think about that. Intelligence sharing, the military bases that we have deployed, all of that,
Mm-hmm.
um, the arms GDP and all of that, is fairly minimal in the grand scheme of things. But but basically kicking the U.S. out of Europe,
Mm-hmm.
would be traumatic for everybody, and it also would open the door on for other aggressors, right? So
Right.
anyway, so that's would just be like, oh my God, I can't even imagine. And then with Greenland, and we've seen here in the last days, is that there is the internal GOP Republican fractures around this, right? So
Right.
that's also creating issues, called political fragmentation, right? So Miller clearly put through his view of the world, right? And I think he did backtrack later and said, that it's not talking about a military operation, blah blah blah. And anyway, so the bottom line, I think we're going to see heavy economic diplomatic pressure, uh, on Greenland,
Mm-hmm.
with military threats out there as leverage, but I don't think anyone's going to take that seriously. But trying to look for a deal, and just to remind people that are listening to this, the total population of Greenland is like 50, I don't know, 8,000 people. Okay, so it's scary for them. Let's put it that way. And so we'll continue to see this. They're trying to negotiate a deal. Can they get something done? Yeah, we'll see. Yeah.
But even without like a military operation or action, can he really walk back what he said, or do you feel like the damage is already done? Once it's out there, it's out there.
No, because it's like, okay, you have this bluster and all this kind of stuff, and Denmark and Greenland, the 58,000 people say we don't want that, but we'll negotiate, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you get to something that is a negotiated resolution and not a kinetic action. I see that definitely.
Okay.
I think that's
So,
what they're trying to do. We'll see
okay.
how it plays out, right? You can also alienate them and make that harder
Exactly.
and harder.
Mm-hmm. So, an interesting angle, Trump pushed for Europe to, increase defense spending, and they pretty much started responding. Could the pressure around Greenland actually accelerate European military capacity in a way that it strengthens NATO and U.S. security, even if the short term effects are a little rocky?
Yeah, I think, the approach that we're taking to Greenland undermines this to some
Mm-hmm.
degree. Um, the I guess the mechanism matters. Threatening a NATO ally doesn't inspire collective commitment, right?
No, not at all.
I would say it triggers a survival instinct. So in that
Mm-hmm.
regard, you know, I think that they're going to start turning inward. Again, it's all of this is rippling through everything globally. Every country now is saying, we can't rely on the U.S. anymore. We need to become more self-sufficient. This is India and everywhere else, or we need to create other partnerships so we have resilience if something was to happen,
Mm-hmm.
with U.S. as a partner. Again, in this case, I think the real risk around Greenland, but again, in the broader context, that the Europe might rearm against the U.S., right?
Mm-hmm.
Unpredictably, and rather than the U.S. against Russia, right? So European leaders would conclude that American guarantees and are kind of like conditional on Trump's whim. So we better prioritize, strategic autonomy and over
Yeah.
transatlantic, and this whole kind of like kumbaya world order that we tried to support and spend a lot of trillions of dollars trying to maintain. I think we could see
Mm-hmm.
that we get sidelined, that they'll move forward without U.S. coordination. That's the problem.
So, Last question. Looking ahead to January 2027,
Oh, the crystal ball.
the crystal ball. Which scenario seems more likely? Venezuela that's beginning to stabilize and leverage its resources with more self reliant Europe working closely with the US? Or prolonged instability in South America embolden adversaries using these precedents and a weakened NATO alliance? Which one?
The second scenario is where my head is. Prolonged instability, emboldened adversaries, it sure looks more likely. When I saw this, I wrote down kind of three things that I thought the kind of the most likely scenario as we go through the next year here. So I am hopeful that we can keep stability in Venezuela and see some modest oil recovery, but it will be constantly plagued by that political uncertainty, right? So that's going to move forward. Europe, there's no question in my mind. I don't care. I mean, the damage is done. They're going to spend more on defense. They're going to bring more autonomy. They're going to create more capacity, within the European partnership, and not rely as heavily on us, right? So that's going to happen, and they're already spending more from the last Trump administration, right? They're
Right.
5%, and they're going to be spending a lot more than that, but they'll have self rule, right? And then China and Russia are going to interpret these actions as kind of validating spheres of influence, that whole kind of Dunro doctrine attitude that says, hey, China, I'm the big fish in the South China Sea and that, and I'm going to, Russia wants to be the powerful dog in the European theater. And so they're going to avoid direct confrontation, but they're going to be asserting themselves. So, neither clean success nor catastrophic failure. I'm not sitting here putting that out there,
Right.
but definitely a more significant erosion of the post-World War II order with no real replacement, right? And that's what's going to create ongoing year-over-year uncertainty. So I wrote down my headline that you can look at in January next year. So the headline is Fractured Order, Venezuela limps forward as U.S. precedent emboldens adversaries and strains the Atlantic alliance. So I think that's
Okay.
where we'll be in 1 year.
Let's see if the New York Times has that same headline. So
It is not funny, but it is funny. But
it's
okay.
you laugh to keep from crying, you know?
Yes, exactly. It's a very troublesome time.
Yes. So I know we'll all be, staying up to date on these future developments. But thank you, Bruce, for joining me and having this
Yes, great.
conversation. And thank you all for listening. To learn more about our events, insights, and member news, visit WTCI.org. And you can also connect with us on all our social channels at WTC Institute. Until next time.